In today's episode of Today in World War II, President Roosevelt makes a very important policy statement on the radio in his broadcast to the American nation about supporting democracy in the UK against the Nazis. The Germans decide to send their super battleship Tirpitz to Norway. Um, Spoiler alert, didn't really do much up there. And then finally, on December 29th, uh, Chechen rebel leader was betrayed and killed to the Soviets. And we'll talk a lot more about that and how stuff like that resonated 45, 80 years later. Let's get started. Okay, so on December 29th, 1940, President Roosevelt did a radio broadcast to the American people. Now remember, this is in 1940. The United States still had not gone to war with the Japanese hadn't attacked. We were still technically neutral, but Roosevelt was very much pro-democracy, very much in favor of doing whatever the United States could do to help the United Kingdom remain free and viable against the Nazis. And so he said that the United States would not be deflected by Axis threats from its policy of providing Great Britain and her allies with all possible aid short of war. He also said that the threat of war would not deter the United States in the slightest degree, and that victory by those resisting aggression was of paramount interest to the United States, and he was confident that the Axis powers would not win the war. Wow. I wish we had had that kind of leadership in the White House in 2 years ago in 2022 when the Russians invaded Ukraine. And it was when he said that when FDR said that it was in paramount interest of the United States that the Axis powers would not win the war. You did not hear anything like that from our president in the White House at that time, and it's disgusting. On today's date, in December 29th, 1941, the German Navy decided to send the battleship Tirpitz to Norway because it would the hopes that it would tie down Allied naval resources in the North Atlantic. The Tirpitz was the sister ship of the Bismarck. These were considered two of the best battleships in any navy in World War II. They didn't have the same range of guns that the Yamato and Musashi had in the Japanese Navy. They had 18-inch guns. The German battleships had 16, but their fire control was excellent. It was just absolutely excellent. And as we saw, the Bismarck really gave more than it got until it got more than it could handle and it was actually sunk. But when we went toe to toe against a heavy cruiser and a battleship, it sank the one and almost sank the other one. So it was very accurate and a very tough ship to deal with. Now, of course, it got sunk. The Royal Navy sent everything they had to get it, and it did sink it. It couldn't go up against an entire navy for the most part, but these were very, very powerful battleships. However, 1942, because obviously it wouldn't be sent until later in January of 1942. That was a whole different landscape than even a year ago with the Bismarck. There was more planes. The U.S. was now in the war. There was more ships available to go after it. So I don't think the Germans really had any intention of sending it out to get sunk. I think they pretty much telegraphed what their motivation and their strategy was to keep it in Norway, and just by being there alone, it could negatively affect Allied plans and Allied tactics in maybe not sending as many convoys to Russia or making different decisions. Actually, in fact, one time we're going to see in a later episode where the threat of a large battleship coming out and to attack a convoy was enough to cause the convoy to scatter which meant that the U-boats and the Luftwaffe were able to pick them off one by one. So it did have some effect, but what it mostly did was just set the Tirpitz up to be a target practice object for the RAF, as we'll see in later events in the war. So that was an interesting decision made by the German Navy. I guess under the circumstances, there wasn't much less they could do because when their Navy ventured out, it tended to get sunk. And then finally, on December 29th, 1944, Chechen rebel leader Hassan Israilov was betrayed by his own men and was killed. And the Chechens got a lot of notoriety in the 90s, and now they're still, well known about what's happening in Ukraine now and here in 2024. They are a Muslim group. They're in the Caucasus Mountains, and they've always been very, how do I put this? They fought for their freedom. They've had a very difficult relationship with the Russian Empire, with the Soviet Union. They were exiled. A lot of the Chechens were exiled to Kazakhstan during the war. They were not considered a loyal people. And then when the Soviet Union fell apart in 1990, 91, I believe it was, there were two wars fought. The first war, the Chechens were able to keep the Soviets away and were declared an independent nation, Ichkeria. And then when Putin came into power, then the second Chechen war happened, and Chechnya was just leveled. Look, the Chechens, you know, I'm not a big fan of the Chechens, okay? I mean, I'll tell you this right now because, before the first war, the Chechen war, I mean, their biggest revenue source for their country was kidnapping people, okay? They were not good people in that sense, right? I mean, can you imagine Rhode Island all of a sudden starting to kidnap people from Ohio and Connecticut and New York and holding them for ransom and all this kind of stuff? I think the federal government would have reacted. So, but like anything else, the Russians, the Soviets, doesn't matter. It's steamroll tactics, level places, and that's what happened later in the war. So I just want to give you that perspective of what happened here. There's always been a very complicated, let's put it that way, euphemistically speaking, complicated relationship in Russia, the Soviet Union, with the Chechens. Okay. Well, it wasn't much in the way of news on today's date and during the war, but what I did feel was noteworthy, I shared with you. I want to thank you for watching this video, and we'll talk tomorrow.